Hey, John, welcome to the Misfit interviews, Misfit Playbook interviews, I guess I should say. It's good to
Thank
have you
you.
here.
Thank you. I'm excited.
So Nelson has already given you the overview of what we're doing here. So we're talking to people about the different Misfit principles and plays or kind of step-by-step instructions that you would give to somebody to help them um, live one of those principles.
Yeah.
And so I'll leave it to you. Which one of the principles out of the many resonated with you, or did all of them?
I mean, all of them did. Sort of advantage of being a misfit, all that resonates with you, but probably the one that caught my attention is experimenting, experimentation. Um, so, a little backstory. I'm a pinhole photographer, and what that means is I don't use a lens. I use basically build cameras that have little tiny holes in them that shoot on film to capture an image. And so it's a niche within a niche within a niche of photography. And so there's no real, you don't see, it's not, since it's film, you don't see a digital image on the back. And so where I got to, sort of where I ended up right now, is I picked it up off a whim for a $23 film camera, and then started playing around with it and experimenting. And most of the stuff I produced was horrible, well, horrible, but there's like one or two elements within what I captured that really caught my attention in a way that digital photography, or what I had been doing in digital photography, hadn't. And so what happened is it became almost an obsession in that I would then go shoot some more, bring it back, look at my film, develop everything, and figure out what I liked, what I didn't, and just slowly dug deeper and deeper to where yesterday I finally shot a 5 foot by 5 foot tent camera that I built. And so, yeah, it's something where it's all because you could almost trace my entire path of where I was yesterday shooting that for the very first time back a year and a half ago, and all the little experiments where you learn bits and pieces that you may not know how they're going to be useful in the future, but they end up coming down the road. I'm like, oh, I know how to do this because I did that earlier and figured that piece of information out. And so now I can I could basically blow up a tiny camera into a 5 foot by 5 foot tent.
That's an incredible story. So, if you were going to give advice to other misfits about how to experiment in their
Sure.
lives, that maybe not be photography, but kind of like even
Yeah,
generic, it doesn't matter what you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah.
What kind of advice would you give people?
So the notion of fail fast is thrown around with regularity on the internet, and I feel that that's great advice if you tweak that notion a little bit, and that failure in and of itself is worthless. It hurts. It sucks. You know, failure is never pleasant. It's what we do with that failure. And so what I've done is sort of tweak that a little bit to view it, to experiment faster. Because the idea of an experiment is that you do something, you record the results, you analyze the results, and then use that piece of information to do that experiment better the next time. And so there's a whole process to look at what you're doing and what you have done, and use that information to do it in the future. And so it's not just this generic go out and find something to fail. There's an actual plan, there's a process in place to get the result, basically get the information you need to make better decisions and get what you want. And that sort of model can be applied to any endeavor whatsoever. Because if you're doing something generally, if any activity a misfit is doing, is there's not really a playbook or a plan to follow. You're not following people's footsteps. So there's this unknown thing you want to accomplish. And so you have an idea of how you want to accomplish it, but you don't know for sure whether that plan. And so what happens is people look at it and go, how do I accomplish X? And then they lay out a 4-year plan. And then as soon as one of those steps goes wrong, the whole wheels come off because that was the plan. But if you take it from the standpoint of little tiny pieces, little tiny experiments where you chip away and then use that information, like every time you do it, you're almost rebuilding your plan because you have new pieces of information. And what happens is you sort of have where you are now, your goal in the future, and in each experiment, you're slowly chipping away, and you'll find that you will know things you never could possibly have known when you started by the time you reach the end.
So it's when I'm hearing you speak, it's almost like if I had to put this into a step-by-step, a play, so to speak, the first thing is to redefine your notion of failure into experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely, because the the failure is always bad. It's the way you've grown up. If you're riding a bike, if you fall off the bike, it always hurts. Like there's not you don't you when you fall off a bike, you don't look at it as oh, I'm learning how to ride a bike. You just look at it as I fell off the bike. But in experiments, there's no inherent right or wrong built into that notion. If that makes sense. Where like failure, there's so much negativity wrapped up in failure because you could reinterpret failure to be positive, but experimentation is sort of a static notion. It doesn't have good or bad built into it. And so if you get a result in an experiment, as long as there is some sort of result, that's a positive outcome.
You've succeeded because you've actually got a result in your experiment. So the other piece that I kind of was hearing in here is you're talking about like two shifts in mindsets. One is you're redefining your notion of failure because you're saying, I'm just experimenting, therefore all my results are successes because I get a result. And you're also redefining the notion of planning. It's kind of like if you put your goal on out there, then you instead of having like a project plan with lots of static steps, what you've got are just a series of experiments that you do that may get you to that and may get you to someplace better. Who knows?
I stole that notion from I believe it's Peter Sim's Little Bets book, and it's the notion that when you start a project, you're basically trying to figure out a solution for the future, or you're implementing a plan for a scenario in the future that you cannot ever know exactly because the future always changing. So if say you're building a business, say you're launching in a year, you don't know the customers that are going to be in the year. You know the current customers, but not the customers who will be there in a year. You don't know the economy in a year. So there's all these big things that you have zero chance of knowing. The only way but as that becomes closer to the present, the more information you can know. And so the idea is that rather than trying to create these giant big bets, where you don't have an information advantage, I think to use his term, what you do is you basically shorten everything down into the smallest. What's the smallest thing you can do to get a result, and then basically from there take that piece of information that you gained from getting that result, and then try to get two results, three, like build up, because then you're growing the size of your bet or the project with the information that you have. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're saying like take the smallest bit of information that you know and try something and do your experiment with kind of like how would I put this, the smallest it's like you got boundaries on it. It's like the smallest yet the biggest, the most manageable. I mean, that's what I'm looking for. The
Yeah,
most manageable chunk of information. Do an experiment with that, and then the next time expand out a little bit and try it with something a little bit more complex or a little larger. Is that what you're getting at?
yeah, absolutely. And the side benefit of approaching things in that way is that you find there's less resistance to action. So like the idea is if you have to sit down and write a book, your the mental block of trying to write a book when you sit down is huge. You understand how much work is required. But if I tell you you have to write a paragraph, almost anyone could write a paragraph. And so, because the idea of what you have to do, what the work required, you you create almost like a mental stumbling block if you take on too big of a project because you don't know how to wrap your head around it. You don't know everything that's involved, how to do it. And so the side benefit is that by reducing things down to the smallest possible action with the biggest potential outcome, you actually improve the odds that you're going to do something instead of talk about it.
It reminds me of a mentor of mine used to say to me that all you have to really do is take your next first step.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, and once you take a step, there's momentum behind your action. So then this next step, in theory, should be easier, and then the more steps you sort of put in sequential order, the easier those steps become. At least in theory, until something life derails you.
I started a new experiment then, huh?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then you've reached a point where something interesting happens.
Do you have some examples from your own life about that, like where you've maybe tried to experiment and something interesting happened, and then you went off in a direction that perhaps got you to some place you never dreamed you'd get to?
Um, so I used to, before I was a photographer, I was a trader for Bank of New York, and there, long story cut extremely short, I was absolutely miserable and burnt out in my job, and so what I was doing is on the weekends I was finding different creative projects to sort of take my mind off of work and sort of get me into a creative space that I didn't have at work. And so I tried woodworking. I like built a couple tables, like wrote. But one of the things I did is I picked up a camera. Like I took photography courses in college and was like a darkroom lab assistant back in college. But it was one of those things where I just picked up the camera again, and it was one of those things where as soon as you took a picture, it was like, oh, this is what I love doing. It sort of brought back everything, and so it became a point. Another long story short, where I ended up quitting to become a photographer.
So experimentation could be used even to answer that question that feels so big to everybody, which is, like, what's my purpose? What's my passion?
Absolutely, and the beauty of sort of like a more like experimental view of your life is that my years up to being a photographer weren't a failure. They're just one experiment that I eventually figured out. But I gained all sorts of information that I'm now using to be a photographer. Like it's not an empty years and then like glorious years. Like
Mm.
there's not this. It's easy to look back in a scenario like this and just look at those 8 years in finance that's completely wasted. But I am so much better photographer because of those years and what I've learned. Not so much related to my craft, but just like how to learn, how to work, get results under extreme pressure, and like all sorts of things that I would never have experienced or even learned without those years. So it it also helps with a lot of I think a lot of you could have the potential for a lot of like depression or sort of like it's easy to look at those time periods and view them as wasted. And so, and then that becomes this almost like black hole views, if that makes sense. Like, where, you know, you're like, why couldn't I have been started? Why earlier? Why did I waste so much time doing this? Why, like, by taking a more viewing your life as an experiment, that means there's information and experiences that are available to be gleaned out of those years. And so it's up to you to sort of look at those and pick the meaningful and like beneficial elements to it, and then you could discard the rest. But don't just don't beat yourself up for experiments that go wrong. Sort of, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and this is such a just mostly just a mindset that you can apply to anything. So you're saying apply it to your past. I could apply it to relationships. Maybe you've been in a few relationships. You don't look at those as failures. Say, well, that was an experiment until I got to the one that's going to stick. Um, but it's also, I think, in true scientific method fashion, if we want to use that kind of mindset for experimentation, it's never over. I mean,
No.
you never get there. It's like you're continually experimenting.
Yeah,
Even
and I
now.
think I think there's a trap where you fall into that says I like right now I'm saying I am a photographer. Well, that does that shouldn't exclude every other expression of who I am. And if you take it more as like if you don't hold those titles as sort of concrete, then the world opens up to things that to taking on things and projects that don't fit those titles. And I think once you take, say, a photographer title and just, or take AJ's example, you know, he's artist, philanthropy, like conference, or like there's so many titles that you could throw on him that a guidance counselor would never ever put together.
So
And
by approaching it this way, you don't put yourself in that box. Like you're not
no,
what you do or who you are. Like you're not even, husband, wife, philanthropist, business person, artist. That's not who you are. That's kind of like all of your life experiments and your.
exactly. And so by by then just by pushing yourself to increase the sort of the experimentational cycle,
Mhm.
it improves the way, like, improves the feedback you're getting,
Yeah.
improves the information you're getting, and then you could just basically just keep on piling on, and you could grow faster than you thought possible.
So when you say the experimental cycle, can you kind of run that by me again? Just I know you mentioned it a couple
Yeah.
of times, but I think
Um,
that might be the steps that we're looking for.
so I've tried.
Besides, you first start with
Yeah.
the mindset shift is the big one, but then after that, what's the cycle?
So there's an actual. So I graduated with a business engineering degree years ago, and there's an actual formulated cycle, and I'm trying to figure out what the acronym is. But basically, the idea is you set your experiment, you experiment, you you report the results. You're like basically catalog what happened, and then you analyze that in relation to the expectations that you started with. And so within that analysis of the expectations, or like the analysis of the results, you then formulate the next. How does your experiment change based off of the results that occurred? Did it agree and you just need to do it bigger, or did something surprise you in that result that you need to stop and consider or alter or whatever? but there's basically you set the expectations, you do it, you report the results, and then you analyze the results.
Okay. So Laura J is kind of is chatting and giving me a summary of what we're talking about, and let me see if this kind of fits with what you're talking about. So if we had steps, the first two are really to change your definition of failure and also your definition of planning. Those are two key things that you talked about.
Yeah.
And then pick some small action that we want to call our experiment, map it to the outcomes that we want, take the smallest action that we think we can take that'll have the biggest possible outcome, and look at your results, adjust.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, and like to be perfectly honest, I'm still working on with the analysis part of this whole sort of plot, like because that's always the hardest part because you have to put away some emotional response to, like, okay, for my example, why didn't I sell X number of photographs? Like, and but like that step is also the most important because that's where you figure out, like, because doing something and then action without a sort of like analysis phase, almost in some way you almost sort of like are throwing darts at that point because in your next action is not influenced by your previous action. It's analysis is the only way to link your actions together.
And I think you said something really important in that is that in doing this, when you're doing that analysis and you're looking at things as an experiment, you're taking some of the emotional sting out of it. So because so many of us are so integrated into our work. So if you don't sell some photographs, you can just think, oh God, poor me, I suck. I didn't sell photographs. But if you're looking at it as an experiment, you kind of distance yourself a little bit from that, and you can do that analysis and at least calm down some of that emotional reaction. Is that?
Yeah, that's 100%. Mm-hmm. And it is really helpful to take that because so much of what we do, it's so easy to get wrapped up in who we are with what we do, and so the results that occur are sort of judgment on us as a person or our skills. And so where if you could separate sort of step away from the emotional aspect somewhat, it's, yeah, I mean, it's nearly impossible unless you're Buddha, maybe. But like, as long as you can look at it with sort of a, you don't sort of analyze the results with the results already determined. If you could free yourself enough to be surprised by the results,
look at it in wonder. I think,
Yeah.
And not to say the emotion isn't bad. I mean, it's.
No.
I think it's to have a little bit of detachment is what we were talking about. What do you think?
I think we humans always tend to have sort of, you want to say on a spectrum, we tend to have too much emotion when it comes to our work. But so you can never remove emotion. I mean, it's what gives our work spark. Like what makes it human. But like enough that at least take the negative sting out of it, out of the results if they don't go your way.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left. So what are your final words of wisdom for your fellow misfits about living this principle?
I think the sort of the beauty of this principle is it allows you to take on sort of big, scary ideas, and like you don't even have to take them in sort of a direct path. You could sort of wander. You could wander a little with experiments, as long as you like stick a couple flags down the road where you want to end up. Sometimes you don't have to look at paths or goals as linear, as where I need to do A B C D E, boom, done. But you could take sort of a work on one thing for a while with other goals in mind, and maybe something along that path all of a sudden solves a problem you had with another goal.
Good.
Like so, so it's good to just pick scary goals and just make them. You don't have to solve them, but just put them in your like where you see them, and that so your brain sort of knows that they're there, and then just have fun and sort of explore, and you'll be surprised at what sort of progress you can make.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today. We appreciate your time and
You're welcome.
your willingness to be vulnerable with us and
Yeah.
talk. Is another one of our principles.
Yeah.
And one final question. When you think of all the misfits that you've met, who would you like to hear from next?
I'll since I know her probably the best, I'll say Bernie.
Ah, okay, Bernie.
Yes.
Well, we've got her on our list, so she's up soon.
Oh, good, good. Love to hear what she talks about.
All right, we'll mention that to her, and you can too. Give her a little nudge to get on this
Oh,
interview. So,
I
all
definitely
right,
will.
thank you, John. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.